Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
It's going to, at least in the United States, it's going to wait until the plaintiff's bar finds enough detransitioners to file a class action lawsuit or some kind of massive malpractice suit that will, wind up with $100 billion judgment. And I think at that point, the trans train will really derail. But, and so it's just going to be massively expensive, and then it'll like unwinding all these people's agony and their pain and suffering. I mean, it'll just be another basically we're going to have to wait till there's another grift to take the place of this grift. And we're going to have to rely on like some future John Edwards type, some like rascal scalawag plaintiff's bar attorney to do it. That's the way I see it. It's a little cynical, but unfortunately, I think that's where we're at.
Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast from the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor at the American Mind and associate editor at the Claremont Review of Books. I am joined by a full house, full crew today, publisher and president Ryan Williams, managing editor Seth Barron, and editor James Poulos. And I guess the summer is technically supposed to be the slow news time, but this is the third time that World War III has been trending on Twitter this year, so not that slow, I suppose. We will begin with Mrs. Pelosi goes to Taiwan. People who listen to our show regularly will probably already be up on the bare minimum facts of this. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, day of meetings on Wednesday. Very loud support for Taiwan and its independence from China, which obviously claims the island as its own. Here's Pelosi. She says, "Today, the world faces a choice between democracy and autocracy. America's determination to preserve democracy here in Taiwan and around the world remains ironclad." Now, this was met with great enthusiasm, from what I understand, among some leaders, at least in Taiwan. It was also met with a pretty firm and aggressive response from China, which is now performing military drills, seeming to threaten, at the time of this recording, we don't know what's going to go on next couple of days, but seeming to threaten to impose upon the Navy space, the ocean space that Taiwan claims as its own. So that's why World War III is trending. This is one of the major kind of geopolitical powder kegs that has been on people's minds since long before Putin invaded Ukraine. But when he did, there were a lot of people that said, well, Taiwan is next. And so this is obviously on like a lot of people's minds. Pelosi's journey has definitely not been well received in China. Here's Major General Sun Lifang, a spokesman for Taiwan's defense ministry, says, "We resolutely defend national sovereignty and will counter any aggression against national sovereignty." And that's on the Taiwan side. And here is Hua Chunying, spokeswoman for China's foreign ministry. She says, "As for the specific countermeasures, what I can tell you is that they'll include everything that should be included. The measures in question will be firm, vigorous, and effective. And the U.S. side and Taiwan independence forces will continue feeling them." So that's where things stand at the moment. Like I say, developing situation, always possible that by the time you are listening to this, things will already have proceeded. But it's worth noting a couple other things before I toss this over to the panel, one of which is kind of intriguing about the way this is being received. There have been, I'd say I've heard mixed conservative responses, some saying, well, Taiwan it is in our interest to defend Taiwan, superconductors, so on and so forth. also, we support democracies. On the other hand, Pelosi being reckless, pulling a stunt, wants to be the first major leader in, I think, 25 years and the biggest political leader to visit. So this is this reckless grandstanding. And interestingly, one group that seems to be on the reckless grandstanding side is the New York Times, which has been pretty harsh about this whole thing. We might get into discussing why that is, but their coverage, sort of front page coverage of it, has been sort of thinly veiled in its disapproval. And then on the op-ed pages, you're getting stuff like why Pelosi's visit to Taiwan is utterly reckless. So with that, that's Thomas Friedman, by the way. And with that, I will hand it over to the group. You guys, what do you think? Utterly reckless, strong display of American support for democracy. What do you make of this?
Neither, really. Those, I think, I don't know, those worried about World War III starting should look at the origins of the last two world wars. They rarely start because of kind of half kabuki dance, put your toe across the line, saber rattling, which this seems to me to be an example of. A lot of posturing, a lot of rhetorical face saving, especially from China, and, shows of force on both sides. But I think the predicates for World War III, this is not. I hope I'm right in that. I sincerely do. But, there's something, I don't know. It's just another entry in the kind of fake and performative and histrionic way in which we conduct ourselves these days. You have
nice self-censorship there.
Thank you. Pelosi wanted. I mean, it's hard to tell how much this is fake or not, right? I mean, how much is the White House actually concerned that basically the second most important person in their party right now for institutional reasons, Nancy Pelosi, is somehow bucking them in their China policy to go visit. Then you've got all the usual neocon and neocon adjacent Congress people, critters, as John Derbyshire calls them, Congress critters, praising her to the hilt. You've got our normal friends on sort of the establishment, and I don't really mean that disparagingly, I just mean positionally, establishment foreign policy hawk right, saying, this must be done. It's great that she's doing it. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to make sense of any of this these days. When we have a regime and its sort of media wings in the main newspapers kind of feeding us a line and a narrative day in and day out, this sort of thing, as you view it through the lens of reporting, because you're not really close to it at all, is very hard to make sense of and very hard to interpret. So who knows?
Yeah, there's a lot of cues and miscues going on here. It certainly doesn't make anyone in charge look like they're in control. And, we've seen kind of Ukraine fade from its current thing positioning. It's hard to be sure from the outside how much of the rhetoric is reflective of pessimism among the insiders or a sort of willingness to kind of drink their own Kool-Aid. I think I'm still mostly convinced that although the U.S. is in pretty rough shape economically and militarily, still better than the other leading brand, it seems that the regime is ready and willing to bet on just pumping a lot of military technology into different countries and hoping for the best. Certainly, there isn't a huge appetite among Americans for another military conflict, and it does seem that the most likely hotspots at this point are ones where we would find ourselves at a disadvantage if we had to deploy force into hostile theater. So it could be that we're just going to remain in this mode of sort of weird dancing. The Chinese have problems of their own, as of course do the Russians and others. And as usual, making sure that that accidents don't lead to catastrophe is a good idea.
I mean, I like Ryan. I mean, I can't really decipher any of this. It does feel like it's like weird signaling going on at, like, I don't know, 3 degrees removed from the public, kind of like, when the Soviet Union was around and, the Kremlin would do something. And I mean, who even knows what's happening or who this is intended for? But I mean, it seems to strain credulity that Nancy Pelosi would be doing this independently of the Biden White House. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, the only thing that actually seems legible is that the New York Times would be upset at upsetting China. I can imagine that they would really like it if everybody would just fold, and that we would embrace the personal union of the U.S. and China. Maybe under Xi, or they could find some neutral character to be the king of the two countries. But so I didn't even know Thomas Friedman was still allowed to write things. But it's good to hear he's on the same train that he's always been.
Right. That's another piece of information that we gleaned from this news cycle, is that Thomas Friedman is still around. And I'm with you, Seth, on the New York Times thing. That's sort of why I raised it. I want to see if anybody else was having that intuition that this is a real, not that we didn't already sort of know the China sympathies of the Times generally, but this is a real moment for them in that way. It seems like they're just so afraid of, and to be fair, I mean, we don't want, as James is saying, nobody wants to be launching into a massive, potentially nuclear global conflict at this juncture of all junctures. But the kind of, I don't know, the it's not hysteria exactly, but the censure, that you would ever think about putting your toe over the China line. I don't think we really need to go that far. And in fact, the part of it that seems clear is the Speaker of the House should be allowed to fly wherever she wants. I mean, the intra-Democrat party of it all is really fascinating to me. The sort of official line is that Biden and his team urged her not to do this. Who knows with these guys what's actually going on behind the scenes? Not that, Biden himself is even really an indicator of the real kind of party leadership. So it does, feel like a whole lot of stunting. I mean, my least favorite part of it from an actual substantive perspective is this Pelosi kind of yet more just bilious rhetoric about we will stand and defend democracy. This is a moment that calls for us all to choose between this and that. I mean, not because I don't think that we have, legitimate allies that we want to protect and, interests around the world, but more because this stuff has, it rings more hollow every time they do it, from Obama's red line on down to Biden's treatment of Putin, vis-a-vis Ukraine. And now here, this kind of big bloviating that everybody now increasingly knows means nothing, except as a kind of, political grandstanding for our own, for the home audience. It just seems to me like that more than anything does kind of damage the US's power and influence on the world stage. This thing where we just become known for sending mid-level functionaries overseas to rattle their sabers about these big ideological words and then never do anything to back it up. The total cheapening and evacuation of meaning that those words like democracy and autocracy are suffering now in very big international ways seems like in itself a really bad thing for global geopolitics. Well, okay, let's talk about stuff at home then. We have just been through another round of primaries, Republican primaries, bringing us a victory for Blake Masters in Arizona. This is a Trump-backed guy. Again, I doubt that our listeners will not have heard of him, but it's worth situating him, I think, in the series of primaries that we've been tracking, most notably the Ohio win for J.D. Vance, another Trump-backed high-profile kind of new right style candidate. Arizona, obviously a hotly watched state for all sorts of reasons. It's red basically, but it's a swing state, and it famously flipped for Biden after having gone for Trump in 2020. And it's then been the subject of ongoing kind of controversy around voting integrity and election fraud and so forth. So this is a big one, and it definitely seems like, Masters came out pretty solidly on top. He won out over this guy, Mark Brnovich, state attorney general, and Jim Lemon. This is like Don Lemon. I can never pronounce that guy's name either, but Jim Lemon, I suppose. So, pretty solid count again in the Trump endorsed camp. He's not batting like 1,000 on that front, but he's certainly had some big wins, and the party itself is taking a certain kind of shape as these guys advance to the front and start to lead. Masters has put forward, like Vance has put forward, a kind of post-Trump Trumpy platform, a very populist agenda driven set of social attitudes, especially about raising a family on one income. That's been one of his big things. I mean, I've really liked his ads, I should say. And but more generally, I'm interested to know what you guys think about, does this give us any new information about how the field is shaping up as we gradually start to roll toward midterms and November?
I would say, Blake Masters and J.D. Vance, they're both backed by Trump. But there's like a key other factor, which is that they both seem like competent, capable, accomplished individuals in their own right.
Yes, and young, totally.
Right. So I guess we'll have a lot more material from which to derive a conclusion after we see what happens with Herschel Walker and Mehmet Oz.
Favorite guy, Mehmet Oz.
Where they're both Trump backed too, right? But there I think we're dealing with there's a quality issue, I guess, is all I'm saying, and maybe maybe we can't forget about quality. Not to insult either. Look, I like Mehmet Oz and I like Herschel Walker, but it does seem like there's certain factors at play that aren't helping.
Right. These are the headliners. I mean, Vance and Masters are really first foot forward guys.
It's I think in some ways, even in a more purple state like Arizona, it's not really all that purple, but recent election cycles at the national level have distorted that a little bit, but or distorted our picture of it. It's a pretty red state in many ways still. They both of them show that aggressive, articulate, composed populism is pretty successful. So that's in a way a sort of post-Trumpism, I suppose. Shockingly, talking candidly and even a bit aggressively and even in an un-PC way about issues that really concern large swaths of voters across as diverse states as Ohio and Arizona is one way to go, or is a successful recipe. Now, we should add, of course, and Spencer mentioned this, it also helps to have a billionaire willing to infuse your campaign with cash when you need it, and to make you, Masters sort of started his rapid ascent in the closing months of this campaign with a lot of ad buying and Trump's endorsement and all the rest. So whatever post-Trumpism looks like, it seems like it in a lot of states it's going to involve Trump signing off on you. So none of this is surprising. This is how politics works. We've had a figure at the head of the Republican Party as president and now still that has reshaped that party in many ways. This often happens in American politics. It's how it happens. At the same time, he was channeling a movement, which is another way that you have American political parties being shifted and transformed. So all that is sort of normal in a way. The personality of Trump, of course, is kind of abnormal, and the lack of experience before going into office, obviously very abnormal. But it seems like a lot of savvy people who care about their country are learning a lot of good lessons from Trump's example. And I think Blake and JD are paradigmatic examples of that. In two very interestingly different states, very red Midwestern state, Ohio, which has been trending red every presidential cycle for the last 4 or 5 at least. And then Arizona, which is diversifying and demographically transforming from the land of kind of cactus drunks and Barry Goldwater to a pretty big and rapidly growing state that is trending a little more blue at times.
Yeah, to that, I think I would only add.
James knows Arizona well, I will add.
Well, yeah, it'll be interesting. Phoenix is the number 5 city in the U.S. by population, growing fast. It's one of the redder of the top 5 cities. You got Houston out there, but I think Houston is kind of unclassifiably purple for various reasons. Chicago, New York, LA, Phoenix, I think is going to be one to watch over the next 5 to 10 years, certainly. And depending on how the politics goes, maybe longer than that. In terms of kind of celebrity candidates, I think the question around the bend is who among our social media influencer class, among the millennials who are now not kids, and the Zoomers, who among them will actually want to run for office, who will be recruited for office, which side of the political face-off will avail themselves of those kinds of candidates. As for now, anyone's guess. My thoughts are not fully baked on this, but I do think it's coming in some form, and whoever cracks that code first is probably gonna, have a few bruises along the way, but ultimately gain some advantage.
Is this a good time to announce my candidacy for state alderman of Nashville, Tennessee? No, I think I just looked up the numbers in Arizona. I guess as of January 2022, we've got 1,501,000 Republicans, 1,364,000 Democrats. That's 34.5% to 31.4%. So, as Ryan was saying, I mean, and as I think I mentioned in my intro too, it's a swing state, and it has flopped in the past, but it also is not negligibly Republican. It's very winnably red, and the kind of default assumption, I think, would be red. I'm interested also in the abrupt switch from the previous segment to this one, as we're talking about, well, these grand geopolitical gestures and rumors of World War III and Pelosi making a big show of, kind of overseas politics. Both Vance and Masters are really not concerned in their candidacy with any of that, almost at all. I mean, I think China and trade protectionism is a big issue in the kind of Trumpism platform. But beyond that, you're talking raising a family on one income, you're talking CRT in schools. I mean, if you add Glenn Youngkin in here, too, as kind of an indicator of where the party's headed, what's winning, what messages are resonating. Our friend Inez Stetman, who's written for the site, likes to say that the culture war is the big tent. And I think these wins are also sort of showing that and reaffirming that message, that the old orthodoxy among kind of Hill staffers and consultants, which was that you don't steer too hard into the religious right, into the sort of cultural crusade, whatever. We kind of be nice and decorous and generous, and in cultural matters, and then we really hit the economy and we hit the foreign wars stuff. That is definitely outdated wisdom at this point. I mean, these are people that are squarely focused on issues at home, on kind of matters of really, national character and philosophy. And that's important, whatever kids being taught in schools. And it's striking to me that those seem to be issues that are really resonating with voters, more and more of whom are really not spending a lot of extra brain space, or are tired of spending extra brain space on what James rightly called, the current thing, the vast worldwide spectacle that has currently occupied or really threatens to sort of occlude everything else from view. That's kind of interesting to me as well. All right. Well, speaking of the culture war, we've got, I don't know if this is, I mean, I guess it is one of the big sort of culture war issues. James is going to probably is going to rebuke me for saying the trans stuff, because he rightly points out that there's a lot more to it than that, more sort of spiritual, philosophical stuff going on under the surface. But there have been a couple of cases recently that we wanted to highlight to do with this really abhorrent practice of shunting children through so-called gender transition services under the aegis of healthcare and even saving lives, right? That if they don't get puberty blockers and if they don't have access to surgery, we are really, denying them life-saving, preventing them from committing suicide. This is something for which there's really no evidence, and if anything, the evidence points in the opposite direction. But the real sort of news here is that there are a couple stirrings, I would say, just interesting moments that indicate that maybe the dam is breaking on this stuff. But I've said that before, and I'm not sure how right I've been. I mean, so the latest one is the Tavistock Child Gender Clinic, and for folks that have not heard of this before, if you follow this stuff, you'll know the name Tavistock because it was the subject of an extraordinarily high-profile case in England. The NHS was coming under scrutiny, especially over the case of Kyra Bell, who was what we call a detransitioner, having regretted the way that she was basically shunted through these services, and has been very brave about speaking out, in both in that court case and in writing. So they've been forced to close over safety fears, and this comes not too long after a Swedish health board has been also kind of reversing course on this and saying this sort of thing does not seem to be helping, and in fact, if anything, like it seems to be causing a whole mess of other problems, as indeed you would expect it to do when a drug that has not been approved for this use is imposed upon children the minute they express the slightest sense of gender confusion. So here's my, I guess, question for the group to kick it off is, the detransition movement has been getting bigger and bigger. And those of us who follow these issues have been, I will say, I have been really riveted to hear from people that, very, very bravely kind of share these stories of how hastily they were not even shunted, but encouraged to mutilate their bodies in irreversible ways and to fiddle with their hormones and so forth at impressionable ages. There's also, of course, the TERF movement, the trans-exclusionary radical feminists who have been gaining a certain degree of strength in numbers, of high-profile fights between J.K. Rowling, who's been really great on this stuff, and the Twitter mobs. And yet, perhaps for reasons that James will now illuminate, the fervor seems to carry on apace. I mean, is the testimony of these people who have been so terribly wounded by this movement, is that kind of gonna be enough? Is there ever a point where we kind of think that this might reveal itself as the 21st century Dr. Mengele that it is, or are we dealing with something that has is going to kind of roll right over these complaints and concerns?
It's gonna, at least in the United States, it's going to wait until the plaintiff's bar finds enough detransitioners to file a class action lawsuit or some kind of massive malpractice suit that will, wind up with $100 billion judgment. And I think at that point, the trans train will really derail. But, and so it's just going to be massively expensive, and then it'll like unwinding all these people's agony and their pain and suffering. I mean, it'll just be another basically we're going to have to wait till there's another grift to take the place of this grift. And we're going to have to rely on like some future John Edwards type, some like rascal scalawag plaintiff's bar attorney to do it. That's the way I see it. It's a little cynical, but unfortunately, I think that's where we're at.
Well, it certainly does seem hard to envision how the trial lawyers will ever go away. It's sometimes easier to envision how our very humanity could disappear easier than the disappearance of the trial lawyers. To a degree, I think that this has echoes of kind of the Peter Thiel sort of Rene Girard thesis of mimetic rivalry, where there's now like basically a competition to become the purest victim, and the escalation means that, you know, you move perhaps from a mode where, well, it's a terrible injustice to stop people from engaging in these transitions to, well, actually, it's an even more terrible injustice to allow them to do this to their children. You know, the one reason why there always seem to be opportunities for the trial lawyers is that this kind of competition to prove that the other side is ever more justly accused, you know, to find an ever better plaintiff seems to be hard for us to get away from in the culture that we have. And I think, you know, as a result, many people are struggling psychologically with how things seem to be getting both more absurd and more serious at the same time. It's, you know, it's difficult to talk about some of this quote unquote stuff without feeling that bizarre laughter is the only appropriate response, but it's also, you know, obviously like that minimizes and trivializes what's going on, whether you're coming at it from the standpoint of someone who, no, this is the frontier of human rights, we must support, or someone who's like, no, this is the frontier of post-human rights, and those rights are not natural, and, you know, you can go down that road. But it is true that the absurd and the gravely serious seem to be merging. For those playing along at home, maybe the case for the stuff is best proved out by the 1985 satirical horror film The Stuff, one of the late Paul Sorvino's films. And I will just read a paragraph here that has echoed in my mind ever since I first read it. So The Stuff is about a substance, an alien substance that is found and becomes a sort of ice cream substitute that people find to be incredibly addictive. But in fact, and this is the quote here, the craze for the dessert is far deadlier than anyone had believed. The stuff is actually a living, parasitic, and possibly sentient organism that gradually takes over the brain. It then mutates those who eat it into bizarre zombie-like creatures before consuming them from the inside and leaving them empty shells of their former selves, unquote. This is an experience that seems to be multiplying on the internet. I don't think there's any question but that social contagion is at work here, not just with trans stuff, but other stuff. And that there is a sense in which we keep talking about the stuff because it is kind of like the stuff of the film. It is like an alien invasion of impulses, of trends, of habits, of different kinds of imitation, different kinds of identity. It seems to be just like leaching into people's lives, making them captive to it in some way. And, you know, and yes, leaving casualties behind, leaving people who do seem to be spiritually broken, if not physically, you know, harmed in some way or another. And technological progress of that sort does seem to be leaving human casualties in its wake. And how we're going to deal with those people, how our form of government can carry on when there are so many people who have been, you know, broken in this way. These are serious questions, and questions that any statesman worthy of the name is going to be forced to confront over, you know, this unfolding era, whether they like it or not.
Yeah. So the salutary countermeasure to the re-education camps that some on the leading edge of the left would want to send us to seem to be rehabilitation camps for the broken souls who've succumbed to the woke mind virus, as Elon Musk put it memorably on Twitter. Interesting. Yeah. And then add to just I think James didn't disagree with Seth that the sum of the rocket fuel of this is the fact that it's actually big business for this whole constellation of interested folks from psychiatrists and psychologists to the drug companies that have very expensive hormone blockers and all the rest. So it's a witch's brew of bad things. The profit motive, sort of the latest woke trends of the ever transmogrifying, diagnostic statistical manual for the psychology industry, and then also the deeper psychological and philosophical viruses at work along the lines James has laid out.
I can imagine some surgeons making money coming and going.
Yeah.
Like, okay. Oh, you no longer want that flesh tube. No problem. Let me see if I think I can reconstruct. I think we still have the plans for the old model.
Yeah. No, it's it's
grotesque.
It is grotesque. Yeah. You'd think there'd be more of a movement afoot amongst the sort of surgical community, sort of getting them back to their old Hippocratic oath roots, about doing no harm as they're lopping breasts off and permanently sterilizing people. It's really, the whole thing is, it's pretty sick.
Well, that book, Douglas Murray's second big book, The Madness of Crowds, had an amazing quote from one of these sort of transgender youth practitioners, Seth, that was almost exactly what you've just said. She said something like, the nice thing about breasts is if you decide you want some later, you can just go get some. So it's like once you've had your mastectomy, then you can come back and reattach the simulacra to your chest of what you decided you want back. And yeah, this is certainly a feature of the whole I mean, the economic feature of it is definitely a part of this. Like just the incentive to get people as Medicaid, because they do become perma-clients, right? I mean, like even if they realize that they've made a mistake, then they still, as Seth is saying, sort of feel they need to return and patronize yet more doctors. And the social contagion part of it is, it does seem like a kind of unholy matrimony between a certain form of, perverse economic incentives and this endless feedback loop that people are in, where their bodies strike them as like the mistake, the big problem, everything that's wrong with the world. And that's a very ancient discomfort, very old idea. And yet it now has a certain purchase, I think, because our technology makes it seem as if we're kind of on the verge of somehow transcending our physical, as it were, lived experience. In the last few minutes we've got here, I want to do a lightning round of responses to a tweet by Pete Buttigieg. I'm just going to read it, and then I'm going to ask what you guys think. Pete Buttigieg, 6:41 a.m., August 2nd, 2022. Our intelligence community is the best. What do you guys think? Are they the best?
You sort of run through the scenarios in which obvious former spook Pete Buttigieg, now transportation secretary, feels compelled to tweet that before most people have had breakfast. Like the whole thing is so odd. And I just say former spook. I don't know how documented that is, but you kind of look at the military career track, as it were, of Pete Buttigieg, and it screams intelligence officer of some weird postmodern perverted sort. No, they're not the best. I mean, I wish our dear friend Angelo Codavilla were still alive to sort of laugh uproariously at that statement. I mean, our intelligence community, which basically had circles run around it by the Russian intelligence community for especially the sort of last 20 years of the Cold War, our intelligence community that really has abandoned in many ways a lot of the human intelligence sources that used to be the bread and butter or it really should be the bread and butter of any rational spy operation in favor of signals intelligence and going all electronic. When you look at the track record of our performance in intelligence and counterintelligence against the Chinese over the last 10 years, it's not exactly a a roster of victors. So I just, but I'm interested in the backstory. What compelled Pete Buttigieg to tweet this early in the morning? I want to know that story.
Yeah, I think it was kind of a troll. I think he's just like, I think what he's doing is, because he's not saying our intelligence community is the best in the world.
Right.
He's not comparing it to other intelligence communities. He's just saying, like, it's like if you said to, like, I don't know, like a secretary who, I don't know, brought you like a Dunkin' Donuts munchkin from the canteen, you'd be like, you're the best. Like it's just kind of like he's just being cute, and it's more of this, like, I don't know, the swishification of the military and the Defense Department. You know, it's kind of like all embodied in Rachel Levine and all the trans generals that they keep assembling for photographs. I just think that there's something like kind of like odd going on with gender and the military. And I think he's kind of like, he's sort of ribbing the old style people who still remember in America that was kind of a little more manly in on its martial side. I don't know what he's doing, but you know, he's a very clever guy at communicating. I mean, that's all he does, right? I mean, he's just like this. He's just like Mr. Message. So he's doing something cute, but I can't quite figure out what it is.
Yeah, this is Yas queening, Yas posting. The days when the left was a hotbed of anti-deep state and anti-military industrial content. People are, it's living memory is going to forget that it wasn't that long ago. And that's a remarkable turn of events that maybe someone will write a book about. I haven't seen such a book. Hopefully we'll get one. It's definitely interesting, for historians and for political scientists, one would think, and for people involved in the arena. So who knows? Maybe a future out of work Buttigieg will himself be the author of such a book.
I like the yassification of our armed forces. That's a very funny concept and totally on point. I mean, didn't they get Bin Laden's like right hand man recently, or second in command? Isn't that maybe what he's referring to here? Yeah, I'm on al-Zawahiri. This was August 1st, right? So I feel like that's the sort of occasion for the tweet to answer Ryan's question, although it could be any number of things. And
I see. Yeah,
you know what I mean. But I certainly think that the vague posting is part of the point. I mean, I can't remember if I have ever on this podcast floated my deep cut conspiracy theory about Pete Buttigieg. If I haven't, I will now. And in fact, I will remind listeners of it anyway, because it relates to my take on this tweet, which is Pete Buttigieg is a heterosexual.
Yeah, I was going to say, Spencer, it's not that he's fake and gay. It's that he's a fake gay.
It's that he's a fake gay. Exactly. Yes. Pete Buttigieg is a heterosexual man. He's straight as an arrow. And here's what happened and it's related to Ryan's idea that he's a spook. When he was kind of coming up through the Ivies and embarking upon the like JFK lookalike trajectory, which these many plucky sort of Caucasian men of a certain social class have embarked upon before him. And believe me, I went to school with many of them. This is a type. They kind of turn them out, and they have a certain aggressiveness and ambition that sort of simmers just below the surface, and they're very nice and charming, and that they would like stab you in the back if you turn around. This is a total thing. People who is recognizable as this guy who obviously had a road laid out before him, a political trajectory. Somewhere along the line, maybe during the military service, wherever, he realizes that actually that type is dead, or at least does not wield the same political command in the Democrat Party. Can't go in the same doors are not going to be open to him if he perfects this particular persona as he had expected, and he's invested already all of this time and energy into it. And so what do? You can't pivot to the right, but you can try to find just like one identity box that you could potentially tick to just give yourself that little extra oomph. You can't go black because Rachel Dolezal tried that and it backfired spectacularly. You can't go trans unless you're deeply committed, because that's just, there's a lot of discomfort involved that we don't need to get into. But you can go gay and you can get a beard, which, I mean, one thing we can all agree on is that nobody, male, female, homosexual, or heterosexual, finds Chasten Buttigieg attractive. So we know that that's what's happening here. Is this this brings me to my take on the tweet, which is our intelligence committee is the best. Is there something you would say if you were like trying to be gay and you just overshot it a little bit, like you were just a little too
fabulous would be too
girl.
obvious. Yeah,
exactly. Like there's no like sparkle emojis. So, but like that's what I think is really going on here. Is I think that Pete Buttigieg is like a little automaton. He's like an alien trying to speak human. He's a straight man trying to speak gay in this new and wild political world that the Democrats are in.
So I would not say that this is corroboration of your theory, Spencer, but we have an acquaintance whose brother is in, meaning Amelia and I do, whose brother is in the entertainment industry, and he's an actor in Hollywood, in his 20s. And he said there's an increasing trend of fake white male gays in Hollywood because it's just one way to get a little bit of a boost in the hierarchy. And we've talked about this before. The huge spike in LGBTQIA identification among Gen Z is a perfectly rational result of this sort of unholy ideological duopoly in our schools of, if you're a cis-het white person, you're kind of stained with evil because of how you were born. That's what critical race theory teaches in various ways. But look, there's open to you this wide new world of queer identities of various sorts. Just pick one and you will be less stained. I think it's all of a piece.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely dovetails with what James was pointing out about social contagion and trans stuff. Is like, if the way that we're going to cope psychologically with the advent of this new machine age is we're going to kind of identify a realm of purity and hunt it down, what are you going to get? You're going to get a whole bunch of people who need like somewhere to go in that doesn't completely distort and because again, like if you're going to claim the trans identity, you kind of have to get behind it, or else you're just Demi Lovato, who just changed her pronouns back to she, her, right? So like you have to really go for it, and not everybody is ready to make that level of commitment to the regime. I mean, Seth and I were talking about this, that like the regime needs a level, that kind of like a low-caste level of just like the foot soldiers that just profess their fealty in some way or another, and like queer non-binary is that level. If you're willing to say that, then you're willing at least to buy into the whole, if you're willing to call yourself queer and non-binary. But let me dovetail it.
Low cost. Yeah, low cost, and no one can really prove that you're lying. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, because like you even using they them pronouns, as we learned from Demi, is kind of exhausting. Like you have to remember, it's incredibly awkward grammatically, and you have to remember, and you also have to constantly be outraged when people get it wrong. But you don't have to do any of that if you're just queer. I mean, this is like kind of a catch-all term for submission and fealty to this new regime. Let me dovetail it also though with the Pelosi thing, which is, do you guys think that this Buttigieg vague posting has anything to do with like a counter messaging or sort of like subsidiary messaging vis-a-vis Taiwan?
The Zawahiri timing makes sense to me. I don't know if anyone read it, but also I learned something new in the whole Zawahiri assassination thing, which is that there is a certain type of hellfire that doesn't explode, but has a bunch of basically knives on it that they call the Ginsu. And that's basically what they killed him with. It's high velocity and blades out of a missile. I mean,
wow,
that gets back to the inner 12-year-old boy in all of us. And that is pretty cool, actually.
When you embarked upon that, Ryan, I thought that you were going to talk about a certain kind of hellfire that the Quran describes as existing for certain forms of sin.
This is from the famous Ginsu section of the Quran or the Hadith. Yeah.
Exactly. It's just said that the Prophet Muhammad said to Aliyah or whatever. Yes. Well, this is it's a kind of it's interesting now that we're getting to wrapping up this series of topics. I did not think they had that much to do with one another, but actually they're sort of interestingly interrelated. And I guess our listeners will be, our listeners who always live in the future from us will be able to figure out whether we were right about our prediction. So if you're listening to this,
it's the beautiful serendipity of an ill prepared for podcast, which is our stock and trade here at the American Mind.
From the beginning, I'm very pro not preparing. Those that don't know can understand it. What happens when we start the podcast at least during my reign, but it's also been true during Ryan's reign. Like we kind of come in, we're like, here are some things. What do we want to talk about? And that's our podcast.
It helps us keep spontaneous and fresh. It works.
That's right. It's all unscripted except the parts that Jake cuts out because they get too spicy. But we should establish a donation tier where if you donate a certain amount of money to Claremont, you get access to the deep cut, like trashed sound files that are too spicy for us to.
The legal department doesn't even tell me that's a bad idea without me knowing for me to know that's a bad idea.
It's probably a bad idea for me to even say it. We're probably in one of the segments right now that needs to speak up because it's too suggestive. All right, folks. A couple items of housekeeping before we go. I am, first of all, our longtime listeners may know this, but I have never once in the lifetime of the show missed an episode of the Roundtable, and that long streak is at last going to come to an end. 131 episodes. I made it to 131
streak, Spencer.
Before, thank you. And I intend to resume it, and we'll just start building back up, and I'll try to make it to 140 next time, but I will be out of town on honeymoon for the next 2 weeks, so we are going to actually skip an episode. We'll take a little summer break, but your feed will not be empty or bereft of TAM content because Ryan's got some awesome interviews that we're going to be dropping. There will also be a new episode of The Close Read, which is our Claremont Review of Books podcast. If you don't listen to that already, you can go check that out as well. It's a separate feed to subscribe to.
Tease that one, Spencer. Who are you talking to this one?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So first of all, the one that's currently out with Alan Gelzo, who's a Princeton historian that wrote this really fabulous long review essay for us in CRB about Alan Taylor, who is a kind of, woke social historian. I'm vastly simplifying. You should read the piece. But he and I had what I thought was a really fascinating conversation just about the nature of history, not only as an academic discipline, but more broadly as a sort of human practice in time. And Gelzo then sort of brought that into the role of the historian today and the social responsibilities, the political responsibilities. Is the historian supposed to be objective? Is he making moral judgments? Why does Alan Taylor fall short? Is it because he makes those moral judgments against the U.S. or is it because his moral judgments are wrong? Really good one in my humble opinion, or not so humble opinion. So go check that out. And then the next one, which is also, I think, really cool, is our very own Dan Mahoney, Center for the American Way of Life fellow, who wrote an excellent long review essay also on the 1619 Project's book, the kind of glossy prestige package that they've brought out. And he did a great takedown of it in CRB. And then we got into the point of the show is to get into some of the issues that are raised by the piece, but there's not space to address in the piece. So we talked about the nature of American education and what can be done to rectify it.
Gentle correction, Spencer. Dan is actually just a senior fellow proper, new senior fellow of ours. Yeah.
Right, you are. Oh, yeah. I'm so sorry. Thank you. That's very helpful. I got that wrong. I was working with somebody else who's a call fellow. But in any case, yes. So senior fellow proper, Dan Mahoney, whose book is just recently out. The Statesman is Thinker, and we did an excerpt from that at the American Mind. It's really an excellent book. So there will be plenty of TAM content to keep you busy, and then 2 weeks from now, Seth will very kindly step in and be a guest host for me while I am away. So thank you all for a delightful 131 episodes. Look forward to the next 140. And with that, I will bid you farewell for a couple of weeks. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at AmericanMind.org, Claremont.org, ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. You can donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate. And don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next week. Although I guess I actually won't talk to you next week.